Chapter 1. The Call for Help. In the small village of Bethany, nestled near Jerusalem, lived a man named Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. They were close friends of Jesus, and he loved them dearly. One day, Lazarus fell gravely ill. His condition worsened quickly, and his sisters grew very worried. Mary and Martha decided to send a message to Jesus, who was staying beyond the Jordan River, teaching his followers. They believed that if Jesus knew, he would come and heal Lazarus. The messenger carried their urgent plea, "Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick." When the messenger reached Jesus and delivered the news, the disciples looked at him with concern. But Jesus, calm as ever, said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby." The disciples were puzzled. What did he mean? Wasn't Lazarus sick? Wouldn't he die without help? But Jesus didn't seem worried. Instead of rushing to Bethany, he stayed where he was for 2 more days, waiting with purpose. The disciples noticed Jesus' calmness and wondered why he delayed. One of them, perhaps Peter, spoke up, "Master, if Lazarus is so sick, shouldn't we go to him quickly?" Jesus turned to them and said, "Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep." The disciples were confused. "Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well," one of them replied, thinking that sleep was a sign of recovery. But Jesus spoke plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him." The disciples looked at one another. Bethany was in Judea, where the religious leaders were already plotting against Jesus. Returning there could be dangerous. Thomas, nicknamed Didymus, finally spoke, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." The journey to Bethany. As they set out, the disciples followed Jesus with heavy hearts. They walked through the rugged terrain, their minds filled with questions. Why had Jesus waited? What did he mean by "Lazarus is not unto death"? And why was he so calm? Jesus walked ahead, resolute. He knew what lay ahead, not just for Lazarus, but for himself. Yet his love for his friends and his commitment to God's plan gave him strength. The journey to Bethany would take time, but Jesus' words echoed in the disciples' minds. This sickness is for the glory of God. They didn't fully understand, but they trusted him, as they had seen his miracles before. Back in Bethany. Meanwhile, in Bethany, Mary and Martha sat by their brother's bedside. Lazarus had grown weaker by the hour, and now he was gone. Their hearts ached with grief. Mourners from the village gathered around them, offering comfort. But the sisters' minds were elsewhere. They whispered to one another, "If only Jesus had been here, our brother would not have died." They still believed in him, but their faith was clouded by sorrow. They waited and wondered, "Will he come?" Little did they know Jesus and his disciples were already on their way. Though the delay seemed like a mystery, Jesus had a purpose. His journey was not just about Lazarus. It was about showing the power of God and strengthening the faith of all who would witness what was to come. Closing thoughts. And so, the stage was set. In Bethany, grief filled the air. On the road, the disciples followed their master with questions and courage. And at the heart of it all, Jesus carried a calm assurance. He knew that this moment of sorrow would soon turn into a story of hope, faith, and the glory of God. Chapter 2. The Journey Back. After 2 days, Jesus turned to his disciples and said, "Let us go into Judea again." The disciples were immediately concerned. They remembered the last time Jesus was in Judea. The people there had tried to stone him. One of them asked, "Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again?" Jesus replied, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him." The disciples were puzzled by his answer. They didn't fully understand what he meant, but they trusted him. Then Jesus said plainly, "Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go, that I may awake him out of sleep." One of the disciples said, "Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well." They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was resting and recovering. But Jesus wasn't talking about ordinary sleep. He said plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him." The disciples looked at one another. They knew the danger waiting for Jesus in Judea. Thomas, who was also called Didymus, spoke with determination. "Let us also go, that we may die with him," he said. The group gathered their things and began the journey back to Bethany. The road was long and dusty. The disciples walked behind Jesus, each deep in thought. They were afraid, but they were also committed to following their master. The journey gave them time to think about Jesus' words. What did he mean when he said he was glad he hadn't been there? Why was he so sure about going back? The disciples couldn't see the full picture yet, but they trusted Jesus, even though they were afraid. As they traveled, the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. The disciples were tired, but they kept walking. They remembered Thomas's words and felt a mix of fear and courage. They didn't know what would happen in Judea, but they believed in Jesus and his mission. Along the way, Jesus spoke to them about light and darkness. "If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world," he said again. The disciples listened carefully, even if they didn't fully understand. Jesus often spoke in ways that made them think deeply. By the time they neared Bethany, the disciples were anxious but ready. They didn't know exactly what Jesus planned to do, but they had faith in him. Their trust in Jesus gave them the strength to face the unknown. As the village came into view, the mood among the disciples was serious. They knew that entering Judea was risky, but they also knew that Jesus' love for Lazarus and his family was strong. Whatever awaited them in Bethany, they would face it together, following their master every step of the way. Chapter 3. Grief in Bethany. In the village of Bethany, Mary and Martha were heartbroken. Their brother Lazarus had died, and their home was filled with sadness. Friends and neighbors came to mourn with them, bringing food and words of comfort. But no words could ease the pain they felt. Martha was always busy, making sure the visitors were taken care of. Mary, on the other hand, sat quietly, weeping for her brother. They both loved Lazarus deeply, and his absence left an empty space in their hearts. Many people had gathered to console the sisters, but their grief was deep. They whispered to one another, "If Jesus had been here, Lazarus would not have died." They believed in Jesus' power, but now it seemed too late. Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days, and the hope of seeing him alive again was gone. Martha's mind was restless. She heard whispers from the visitors. "Will Jesus come?" someone asked. Martha did not know, but she hoped he would. She kept thinking about what Jesus might have done if he had been there earlier. The house was filled with the sound of weeping and soft prayers. Outside, the air was heavy, and the tomb of Lazarus stood silent on the hillside. It was sealed with a large stone, and no one dared to approach it. Suddenly, word came that Jesus was on his way. Someone had seen him and his disciples walking toward the village. When Martha heard this, she quickly got up and went to meet him. Mary stayed in the house, surrounded by the mourners. When Martha reached Jesus, her voice trembled with emotion. "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died," she said. Her heart was full of sorrow, but also faith. "But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee." Jesus looked at her with compassion. "Thy brother shall rise again," he said. Martha nodded, thinking about the future. "I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day," she replied. Then Jesus said something that gave her a glimmer of hope. "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this?" Martha looked into his eyes and said, "Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world." After speaking with Jesus, Martha went back to the house and called for Mary. She whispered to her, "The Master is come, and calleth for thee." Mary quickly got up and went to meet Jesus. The mourners saw her leave and followed, thinking she was going to the tomb to weep. But Mary was going to see the one she trusted most. When Mary reached Jesus, she fell at his feet, crying, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died," she said, her tears flowing freely. Jesus saw her sorrow and the grief of those who followed her. His heart was deeply moved. He asked, "Where have ye laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." As they led him to the tomb, Jesus wept. The people saw his tears and said, "Behold how he loved him." But some of them wondered aloud, "Could not this man, which opened the eyes of the blind, have caused that even this man should not have died?" Jesus' grief was not just for Lazarus, but for the pain and loss that sin had brought into the world. He knew what he was about to do, but he shared in the sorrow of those he loved. The group reached the tomb. The stone stood firmly in place, sealing Lazarus inside. The air was quiet, filled only with the sound of soft weeping. Jesus stood before the tomb, ready to reveal the glory of God in a way no one expected. Chapter 4. The Power of Compassion. Jesus stood before the tomb of Lazarus. The large stone sealing the entrance loomed before him, a symbol of death and loss. The mourners around him were silent, watching his every move. Some were curious, others doubtful, and many were filled with sorrow. Jesus looked up and said, "Take ye away the stone." Martha, always practical, hesitated. "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days," she said. Jesus turned to her with gentle reassurance. "Said I not unto thee, that, if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God?" Martha nodded, and with a mixture of faith and uncertainty, she gave her consent. The men standing nearby stepped forward and began to roll the heavy stone away. It took effort, but soon the entrance to the tomb was open. The air was still, and all eyes were on Jesus. Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven and prayed, "Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I knew that thou hearest me always. But because of the people which stand by I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me." His voice was calm yet powerful. Everyone listened, feeling the weight of his words. This was not just a moment for Lazarus. It was a moment for everyone present to witness the power of God. After his prayer, Jesus stood at the entrance of the tomb. He cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The crowd held their breath. Some were filled with hope, others with doubt. The tomb was silent for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, from the darkness, movement stirred. Lazarus appeared at the entrance of the tomb, still wrapped in the grave clothes that bound his hands, feet, and face. Gasps and cries of astonishment filled the air. The impossible had happened. The man who had been dead for 4 days was now alive. Jesus spoke again, "Loose him and let him go." The people hurried to remove the grave clothes from Lazarus. As they freed him, he stood fully alive, his eyes blinking in the light of day. The crowd was in awe, some weeping with joy, others overwhelmed with amazement. Mary and Martha ran to their brother, embracing him tightly. Their grief turned to joy as they held Lazarus, who was now living proof of God's power and Jesus' love. The people who had come to mourn were now witnesses to a miracle. Many of them believed in Jesus that day, realizing that he truly was sent by God. They saw his compassion, his power, and his connection to the Father. But not everyone was joyful. Among the crowd were some who felt threatened by what they had seen. They hurried away to tell the Pharisees what Jesus had done. This miracle would not only bring glory to God, but also set into motion events that would lead to Jesus' ultimate sacrifice. As the crowd began to disperse, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus stayed close to Jesus. They knew their lives would never be the same. Their home, once filled with sorrow, was now a place of hope and faith. They understood more than ever that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. Jesus stayed with them for a time, sharing in their joy and offering words of comfort. His compassion had not only brought Lazarus back to life, but had also strengthened the faith of everyone who believed in him. The power of Jesus' compassion reached beyond the village of Bethany. The story of Lazarus spread far and wide, touching the hearts of many who heard it. It was a reminder that God's love is greater than death, and His power can bring life even in the darkest moments. This miracle was not just about raising a man from the dead. It was a sign of what was to come. Jesus' own death and resurrection would soon reveal God's ultimate plan to save the world. But for now, in the village of Bethany, the power of compassion had brought new life and unshakable faith to all who believed. Chapter 5. The miracle unfolds. The news of Lazarus' resurrection spread quickly through Bethany and beyond. People could hardly believe it. A man who had been dead for 4 days was alive again. The miracle brought many visitors to the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Some came out of curiosity, others to see the man who had been raised from the dead, and many came to believe in Jesus as the Son of God. Lazarus sat among the visitors, healthy and full of life. He smiled and spoke with the people who came to see him. His presence was a living testimony to the power of Jesus. Everyone who saw him knew that this was not a trick or an illusion. Lazarus was truly alive, and only God could have done such a thing. The Pharisees, however, were not pleased. Word of the miracle had reached Jerusalem, and many of the religious leaders gathered to discuss what had happened. They were worried about Jesus. His teachings and miracles were drawing large crowds, and the people were beginning to believe that he was the Messiah. This threatened their authority and their position with the Roman rulers. One of the Pharisees spoke with urgency. "What do we? For this man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." Caiaphas, the high priest, stood up and addressed the group. "Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not." Though Caiaphas did not fully understand the significance of his words, he unknowingly spoke a prophecy. Jesus would indeed die, not only for the nation of Israel but for all people, to bring salvation to the world. The Pharisees and chief priests began to plot against Jesus. They feared his growing influence and decided that he must be stopped. This marked the beginning of a plan to arrest him and bring him to trial. But Jesus, knowing their intentions, continued to teach and perform miracles. His time had not yet come, and he moved according to God's plan. Back in Bethany, the miracle of Lazarus continued to touch lives. Mary and Martha were filled with gratitude and faith. They knew that Jesus had not only restored their brother to life, but had also shown the world a glimpse of God's power and love. The visitors who came to see Lazarus often stayed to listen to Mary and Martha's story. They shared how Jesus had comforted them in their grief, and how he had called Lazarus out of the tomb with his powerful voice. "We thought all hope was gone," Martha would say, "but Jesus showed us that nothing is impossible with God." The miracle also strengthened the faith of Jesus' disciples. They had seen many wonders before, but this was unlike anything they had witnessed. They now understood more clearly that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. His words to Martha echoed in their hearts, reminding them of his divine mission. As the days passed, the village of Bethany became a place of hope and faith. People who heard about the miracle came from nearby towns to see for themselves. Some brought their sick loved ones, hoping that Jesus would heal them. Others came simply to hear his teachings and learn more about the kingdom of God. Despite the joy and wonder surrounding the miracle, danger was drawing closer. The Pharisees' plot against Jesus was growing more serious. They even considered harming Lazarus, as his very existence was a powerful testimony to Jesus' divine authority. But Jesus remained calm and focused. He knew what lay ahead and trusted in God's plan. The miracle of Lazarus was more than just the raising of a man from the dead. It was a sign of who Jesus was and what he had come to do. It showed that he had power over life and death, and it pointed to the greater miracle that was yet to come, his own resurrection. For now, the people of Bethany rejoiced. They celebrated the life of Lazarus and the love of Jesus. They shared their stories with everyone who would listen, spreading the good news of what God had done in their village. The miracle unfolded not just in the raising of Lazarus, but in the faith, hope, and love it inspired in the hearts of all who believed. It was a reminder that even in the face of death, God's power and compassion bring new life and unshakable faith. Chapter 6. The Reaction. The news of Lazarus' resurrection spread far and wide. People were amazed by what they heard. Many believed that only God could perform such a miracle, and they began to see Jesus as the Messiah. His name was spoken in every town and village, and his followers grew in number. In Bethany, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus continued to welcome visitors who wanted to see for themselves what had happened. Lazarus sat among them, alive and well. People who had once doubted were now convinced. They whispered to each other, saying, "Truly, this man Jesus is sent by God." But not everyone was joyful. Some of the Pharisees were deeply troubled by the news. They saw Jesus' growing influence as a threat to their authority. They worried that if too many people believed in him, the Romans might step in and take control, putting an end to their power and their nation. Some of those who witnessed the miracle went to the Pharisees to report what Jesus had done. The religious leaders gathered in a council to discuss their concerns. "What do we?" they asked each other. "For this man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." The high priest Caiaphas stood up and spoke. "You know nothing at all," he said, "nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not." Caiaphas' words were a turning point. Though he did not realize it, he was speaking a prophecy. Jesus would die, not just for the nation of Israel, but for all people. His death would bring salvation to the world. From that day forward, the Pharisees and chief priests plotted to kill Jesus. They were determined to stop him, no matter what it took. The miracle of Lazarus had revealed Jesus' divine power, but it had also made him a target. Jesus knew of their plans, but he was not afraid. He continued to teach and perform miracles, knowing that everything was unfolding according to God's plan. He left Bethany for a time, moving to a town near the wilderness with his disciples. There, he continued to prepare them for what was to come. In the meantime, the story of Lazarus continued to spread. People talked about it in the markets, in their homes, and on the roads. Many who had once been unsure about Jesus now believed in him. They saw the miracle as proof that he was the Son of God. As the Passover approached, Jerusalem grew busier. Pilgrims from all over came to the city to celebrate the feast. Among them were many who had heard about Jesus and wanted to see him. Some hoped to witness a miracle, while others wanted to hear his teachings. The Pharisees watched the crowds with unease. They saw how people were drawn to Jesus, and they felt their control slipping away. They gave orders that if anyone knew where Jesus was, they should report it so that he could be arrested. In Bethany, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus remained faithful. They knew the danger Jesus faced, but they also trusted in his words and his mission. They shared their story with everyone who visited, pointing people to the power and love of God. The reaction to Lazarus' resurrection showed the divide among the people. Some opened their hearts to believe, while others hardened their hearts in fear and jealousy. But through it all, God's plan was at work. The miracle was not just about bringing a man back to life. It was a sign of what was to come, a reminder that Jesus had the power over life and death, and that his sacrifice would bring eternal life to all who believed. The stage was set for the final days of Jesus' earthly ministry. The reaction to Lazarus' resurrection had revealed the hearts of many and set into motion events that would change the world forever. Chapter 7. Faith and Fallout. The story of Lazarus' resurrection continued to stir the hearts of many. Some embraced it as proof that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. Others, however, grew more determined to oppose him. The aftermath of this great miracle revealed the deep divide between faith and rejection. The Pharisees, alarmed by Jesus' growing influence, called another council. They spoke in hushed but urgent tones, discussing what should be done. "If we let him continue," one of them said, all men will believe on him. Then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Caiaphas, the high priest, rose to address them. "You do not understand," he began. "It is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." His words were cold, calculated, and deliberate. Though he spoke from fear and self-interest, he unknowingly declared a prophecy. Jesus would die not only for Israel but for all people, bringing salvation to the world. From that moment, the religious leaders actively plotted to take Jesus' life. They watched him closely and waited for the right opportunity. Their hearts, hardened by pride and jealousy, refused to see the truth of who he was. Meanwhile, the people who had witnessed Lazarus' resurrection could not stop talking about it. The news spread quickly, and many believed in Jesus because of it. The crowds that followed him grew larger, filled with those who sought his teaching and healing. For those who had longed for hope, Jesus' presence brought comfort and joy. But with this growing attention came danger. Jesus could no longer walk openly among the people without risking immediate arrest. He withdrew with his disciples to a town near the wilderness called Ephraim. There, in the quieter surroundings, he continued to prepare them for what lay ahead. As the days passed, the anticipation of the upcoming Passover feast grew. Pilgrims from every corner of the region began their journey to Jerusalem. Among them were many who had heard of Jesus and hoped to see him during the feast. The city buzzed with whispers about his miracles and questions about his whereabouts. The religious leaders issued clear instructions. They ordered anyone who saw Jesus to report him so that he could be taken into custody. Despite their fear of the crowds, they were determined to carry out their plan. In Bethany, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus remained faithful witnesses to God's power. They welcomed those who came to hear their story and encouraged others to trust in Jesus. Lazarus, once dead but now fully alive, was a living testimony that could not be ignored. Many who met him believed in Jesus and spread the word even further. This only deepened the anger of the Pharisees. They decided not only to target Jesus, but also to kill Lazarus. His very existence was a threat to their authority, for he was undeniable proof of Jesus' divine power. As the Passover approached, Jesus and his disciples prepared to return to Jerusalem. Though he knew the danger awaiting him, he was resolute. Every step he took was part of God's plan, and he walked forward with courage and purpose. The atmosphere in Jerusalem grew more tense with each passing day. The people debated among themselves, asking, "Will he come to the feast?" Some hoped to see him perform another miracle, while others waited to see how the religious leaders would respond. Faith and fear clashed in the hearts of many. For those who believed, Jesus represented hope and salvation. For those who opposed him, he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Yet through it all, Jesus remained focused on his mission, to glorify God and offer eternal life to all who would believe. The fallout from Lazarus' resurrection marked the beginning of the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. It set into motion the events that would lead to his crucifixion and resurrection. Even in the face of growing opposition, his love and compassion never wavered. He continued to teach, heal, and guide those who followed him, preparing them for the ultimate sacrifice he would make. As Jesus and his disciples made their way toward Jerusalem, the stage was set for the final chapter of his ministry. The miracle of Lazarus had shown his power over death, but the greatest act of love and redemption was yet to come. Through faith and fallout, the world would soon witness the fulfillment of God's perfect plan.